The little black girl whispered to the biker that a lieutenant framed her mom to shield a corrupt witness. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A little black girl, no older than 10, ran down the street, tears streaming down her face. Her dress was torn at the hem, her knees scraped, and her eyes were wide with fear as she frantically looked around for help. She had just escaped the clutches of someone who had been trying to hurt her family. She wasn't just running from danger, she was running toward it, hoping someone would listen, someone would help. The streets were quiet in the early evening, but she knew that the people she needed were close by. She found them in a small biker bar on the corner, tucked away from the bustling city. The bikers who frequented this place weren't your usual troublemakers. They had long since shed the rough image the world had painted of them. These men and women were family, and when someone needed help, they didn't hesitate. As she approached the bar, she felt her heart racing, knowing she was about to tell them something that could change everything. Without even knocking, she burst through the door, her small voice barely audible over the noise. Please, you have to help. They took my mom. They framed her. Her words were met with a deep silence as the bikers turned to look at the girl. One of the bikers, a man with a thick beard and worn leather, stepped forward. His name was Rick, and he had seen things in his life that most people couldn't imagine. But the desperation in the girl's eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. She was shaking, clutching at his vest as though her life depended on it. What do you mean? Who framed her? Rick's voice was calm, but his eyes narrowed as he prepared for the worst. A lieutenant. He's the one who did it. He's protecting someone, and my mom is the one who's going to pay for it. The words hung in the air, and the bikers exchanged glances. They weren't just hearing about an injustice, they were feeling it. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop. This was about a little girl who had nowhere else to turn. Rick turned to the others. We're riding out. We're going to find out what happened, and we're not stopping until we get the truth. The room erupted into action. The bikers, who had been enjoying their quiet night, immediately began to gather their things. They weren't just heading out for a ride. They were heading into a battle they didn't fully understand, but one they couldn't ignore. As the engines of their motorcycles roared to life, they knew that they weren't just riding to save one person, they were riding for justice. But even as the sound of the engines filled the air, a nagging feeling crept into Rick's mind. This wasn't going to be easy. The lieutenant wasn't just any cop. He was a powerful man, a man who could make people disappear without a trace. But the bikers weren't afraid. They had made a promise years ago to always protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As they rode into the night, the girl sat quietly at the front of Rick's bike, her small hands gripping the leather vest tightly. She didn't know what was going to happen, but for the first time that day, she felt like someone was finally listening to her. They were on their way, and for the first time in a long while, she dared to hope. As the bikers roared down the dark highway, the wind howling around them, Rick kept his focus on the road ahead, his eyes flicking occasionally to the rearview mirror. The engines of the 67 motorcycles reverberated through the night like a thunderstorm, a powerful signal to anyone who dared to challenge them. The little girl, Marcus, clung tightly to Rick's leather vest, her small body shaking against the vibrations of the Harley. She had been quiet for the last few miles, her face pressed against his back, but Rick could feel her fear. They were heading into unknown territory, and he could sense the weight of what was at stake. The sound of the engines was deafening, but it did little to drown out the thoughts racing through his mind. Who was this lieutenant that had framed Marcus's mother? And what kind of power did he really hold over the city? Rick had seen his share of corruption in his years on the road, but something about this felt different. As they sped through the night, heading toward the hospital where Marcus's mother was supposedly being held, the gravity of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about saving a woman from false accusations. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that could shake the very foundations of the system. After what felt like hours, the convoy of bikers reached the outskirts of the small town where the hospital stood. It was a quiet, unassuming place, nothing like the bustling cities the bikers had ridden through. The buildings were old, and the streets were empty. The faint glow of streetlights barely cut through the darkness, casting long shadows along the cracked sidewalks. As the convoy rolled into the hospital parking lot, Rick's mind raced. What would they find inside? Would they be able to protect Marcus's mother? He glanced over his shoulder to see the rest of the Thunderwolves MC parking their bikes in a tight formation, blocking off any possible exits. They weren't here for a casual visit. They were here to make sure justice was served. The bikers dismounted quickly, some adjusting their leather cuts while others checked the weapons they carried. Rick scanned the hospital entrance, where the glass doors slid open and closed with a soft whoosh. The place seemed eerily quiet for such a large building, and Rick knew something wasn't right. Marcus's hand tightened on his sleeve, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Please, help my mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's in there. They're going to take her away." Rick gave her a reassuring nod, but inside, his stomach was tightening with the growing dread that something far worse was about to unfold. They had to move quickly. "Stay close," Rick said softly to Marcus, his voice low but firm. "We're not letting anyone take your mom." The group of bikers, led by Rick, strode through the hospital's sliding doors, their heavy boots making a sound that echoed down the sterile hallways. The reception desk was just ahead, where a nurse sat with her head down, tapping away at a computer. She didn't notice the group of bikers approaching, but when Rick reached the counter, her head snapped up and her eyes widened in surprise. She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between the bikers and the security guard at the back of the room. Rick leaned over the counter, his imposing presence enough to make the nurse swallow nervously. "We're here to see Marcus's mother," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The nurse's fingers trembled as she pulled up the information on her screen. "I am sorry," she stammered. "But, she's not allowed visitors right now." Rick raised an eyebrow, his gaze hardening. "She's being held against her will." "That's not a question." Before the nurse could respond, a figure emerged from the hallway. It was a man in a suit, walking briskly toward them with a stern expression on his face. His name tag read Lieutenant Mark Donovan. The sight of him made Rick's blood run cold. There was something about his presence that screamed danger. The man stopped just short of Rick and the others, crossing his arms. "This is a private matter," Lieutenant Donovan said coolly, his eyes scanning the bikers. "You need to leave." Rick didn't move. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," he said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't take his eyes off the lieutenant. He could feel the tension in the room building as the nurse watched nervously from behind the counter. The bikers stood still, waiting for Rick's next move. Donovan's face twitched slightly, but he didn't flinch. "I suggest you leave now before things get messy," he warned. Rick didn't respond immediately. He simply stepped forward, closing the gap between them. His presence loomed over the lieutenant, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire room held its breath. Then, without warning, a faint sound came from behind them. A soft cry. Rick turned to see Marcus, the little girl, standing in the doorway to the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. "My mom's not guilty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please help her." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, even Donovan seemed to hesitate. The power of the moment was too strong to ignore. Rick's jaw tightened, and he glanced at the other bikers. "Let's go," he said. Without another word, they started toward the hallway, following the sound of Marcus's small voice. This was only the beginning. The hallway was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as the bikers moved through it, their boots echoing on the linoleum floor. Rick walked ahead, his mind racing. They were close now, so close to finding out what had really happened to Marcus's mother. The lieutenant's words still rang in his ears. "This is a private matter," and Rick knew that he wasn't going to just walk away from this. Not after everything that had happened, not when the life of an innocent woman hung in the balance. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure Marcus was still following, her small face filled with determination, though the fear in her eyes hadn't completely disappeared. The other bikers flanked him, their expressions hard, ready for anything. Rick had seen it all before. Death, betrayal, corruption, but this felt different. There was something about the way the lieutenant spoke, something that made Rick uneasy. The truth was being hidden here, and he wasn't going to stop until it was exposed. They reached a door at the end of the hallway. Rick pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn against the late afternoon sun. At first, Rick didn't see anything unusual, but then he noticed a figure sitting by the window. It was Marcus's mother. She was lying in a hospital bed, her thin body barely visible beneath the blankets. The sight of her sent a chill down Rick's spine. He could see the bruises on her neck, the discoloration of her skin from what looked like weeks of neglect. Her eyes were closed, and her face was pale, but when the bikers entered the room, her eyelids fluttered open. She looked at them, and for a moment, Rick thought she might be too weak to even speak. But then, her eyes locked onto Marcus, and a small, pained smile spread across her face. "You came," she whispered. "I knew you would." Marcus rushed to her side, taking her hand gently. "Mom, you're going to be okay. We're going to fix this. We're going to make sure they don't take you." Rick stood back, watching the scene unfold. He could see how much the little girl loved her mother, how much pain she had been carrying. It was heartbreaking, but there was no time for sentiment now. Rick turned to the others. "Stay alert," he said quietly. "We don't know what we're up against yet. We need to be careful." As the bikers positioned themselves around the room, Rick approached Marcus's mother. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. She managed to lift her head slightly. "Like I've been living in a nightmare." Her voice was hoarse, and it hurt Rick to hear her speak like that. "They want to send me away. To prison, I think." "We're not letting that happen," Rick assured her. "But we need to know exactly what happened. What did they do to you?" Marcus's mother's eyes flickered, and for a moment, it seemed like she might drift off again. But then, she took a shaky breath and began to speak, her words barely audible. "It started a few weeks ago. The lieutenant, he came to me, said he needed me to testify against someone." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I didn't know the whole story. He never told me everything." Rick leaned forward, listening closely. "What did he want you to do?" "He framed me," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know at the time, but he set me up. I was supposed to be the witness in a case against a man who was involved in a drug deal. But when I refused to lie, he made sure I would pay for it." Rick's jaw tightened. This was worse than he had imagined. He had suspected corruption, but this was much deeper than he had thought. "So, the lieutenant's been covering up his own crimes?" Rick asked, his voice dark with fury. "Yes," she whispered. "He's trying to protect a witness, a man who's connected to the cartel. If I tell the truth, everything will fall apart for him." Rick turned to the other bikers. "We need to act fast. If what she's saying is true, then this goes all the way to the top. We can't let them silence her." As he spoke, a soft sound came from outside the room. Rick held up a hand, signaling the others to be quiet. He walked slowly toward the door, peeking out into the hallway. His heart skipped a beat when he saw two uniformed officers standing near the entrance. One of them was the lieutenant. They were here. "It's time," Rick muttered under his breath. He turned back to the others. "We're going to make sure they don't take her." The tension in the room was palpable as the bikers prepared for what was coming. They were no strangers to danger, but this was different. They were up against the system itself. They were going to have to fight smarter, not just harder. As Rick and the others moved into position, Marcus's mother whispered one last thing. "Be careful," she said, her voice weak. "They're watching." Rick nodded, his face hardening. "We know." The tension in the room was thick, the silence almost unbearable as Rick peered out into the hallway, watching the two uniformed officers standing just beyond the door. The lieutenant's presence felt like a storm cloud gathering, dark and ominous. Rick's hand tightened around the handle of his bike chain, the familiar grip grounding him in the present. His mind raced, calculating their next move. It was clear now that this wasn't just about rescuing Marcus's mother. This was about exposing corruption that ran far deeper than they could have imagined. The bikers moved into position, their leather vests glinting in the dim light of the hallway. Jack Forge, the leader of the Thunderwolves MC, stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "We need to act fast," he whispered to the others. "We've got to stop the lieutenant before he can make his move." The hospital seemed quiet enough, but Rick could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier. The officers out there weren't just here to protect the hospital. They were here to protect the lieutenant's lives. Every second that passed, the risk of Marcus's mother being whisked away grew greater. Without hesitation, Rick turned to the rest of the crew. "We're not just backing down this time. This is bigger than any of us. We're not going to let them bury the truth." He could see the determination in the eyes of his brothers and sisters, their faces hard with resolve. The bikers knew that what was coming wouldn't be easy. They had faced down bigger threats, but this time it was personal. The lieutenant's corruption was intertwined with their own community, with the very system that should have protected people like Marcus and her mother. They weren't just fighting for a woman's freedom. They were fighting for justice itself. Rick motioned for everyone to move out. They slipped through the door and into the hallway, the heavy sound of boots on the tile reverberating through the space. Rick's heart raced as he approached the two officers who were standing near the elevator. The lieutenant turned just as Rick made his move. "What do you think you're doing here?" The lieutenant sneered, his cold eyes narrowing as he saw the bikers approaching. "This is a private matter. You're not welcome." Rick stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "We're here for Marcus's mother, and we're not leaving without her." The lieutenant's lip curled into a sneer. He took a step back, clearly sizing Rick up, but it was clear from the look in his eyes that he wasn't going to back down without a fight. "You think you can just walk in here and intimidate everyone?" he barked, his hand hovering near his holster. "I don't need to intimidate anyone," Rick replied, his voice steady. "I just need to make sure Marcus's mother is safe." The standoff between Rick and the lieutenant seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The air between them crackled with tension, and Rick could almost hear the lieutenant's mind working, trying to figure out his next move. But Rick didn't wait for him to act. With a sharp nod to the others, he signaled for the bikers to move forward. In a flash, they surrounded the officers, cutting off any escape routes. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "You're making a huge mistake," he warned, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. Rick held his ground, not giving an inch. "The only mistake was thinking you could get away with this." The bikers moved quickly, each one in perfect sync, with Rick leading the charge. They made their way down the corridor to the room where Marcus's mother was being kept. The door was locked, but Rick didn't hesitate. He turned to the nearest biker, a burly man named Storm, who pulled out a set of tools from his vest and got to work. Within moments, the door creaked open, revealing the hospital room inside. Marcus's mother lay unconscious on the bed, her body frail and bruised. The sight of her made Rick's heart ache, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. They were running out of time. "We're getting you out of here," Rick whispered as he approached her bedside, his voice filled with resolve. The other bikers immediately went to work, securing the room and making sure there were no other officers nearby. Rick turned to Storm and the others, his voice low but firm. "We need to move fast. The lieutenant will be coming for her any minute now." Storm nodded, standing guard at the door. "I've got your back." With one last glance at Marcus's mother, Rick turned to the others. "Let's get her to safety." The bikers made their way through the hospital, moving swiftly and quietly through the dimly lit hallways. The sound of their boots echoed softly, but Rick wasn't worried about being heard. He knew that the element of surprise was on their side. As they reached the back exit, the night air hit them like a wave. Rick could see the headlights of a car parked just outside, and his heart skipped a beat. The lieutenant's car was parked right there, but they had no time to waste. "Move it," Rick barked, his voice filled with urgency. The bikers moved quickly, lifting Marcus's mother into the back of a van that was waiting for them. As the doors slammed shut, Rick looked around. The battle wasn't over yet, but for now, they had won. The first part of their mission was complete, and as the van sped off into the night, Rick allowed himself a small, fleeting sense of relief. They were one step closer to exposing the truth, and there was no turning back now. The van sped down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. Rick sat in the front seat, his grip tight on the wheel, his mind racing with what they had just done. They had gotten Marcus's mother out of the hospital, but that was only the beginning. They were still miles away from safety, and the lieutenant's forces weren't the type to let things go easily. The sound of the engine humming was the only thing that filled the silence in the van. Rick glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the others in the back, their faces filled with determination. They had done what needed to be done, but there was still the bigger task ahead, exposing the lieutenant's corruption and ensuring Marcus's mother would be safe. The weight of the situation pressed down on Rick's shoulders, but he didn't let it show. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. As they approached the outskirts of town, Rick's phone buzzed. He picked it up, reading the message quickly. It was from Storm. "The lieutenant is making moves. He's already got backup." Rick cursed under his breath. He had known they wouldn't be able to keep her hidden for long. "What's the plan?" The message continued. Rick typed back quickly, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "We need to get her to a safe house. Then, we go after the lieutenant." Rick hit send and put the phone down, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the lieutenant to make his next move. They needed to take action. The group had come too far, and they weren't about to let this corrupt officer tear their lives apart. They had to finish what they started. "We're almost there," Rick said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The others nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Storm had sent word that the lieutenant was gathering reinforcements, and it was clear they were all in danger now. The stakes had grown much higher than anyone could have anticipated. "Stay sharp," Rick added as he made a sharp turn onto a smaller road. "This isn't over yet." The van rattled as it sped down the narrow road, but Rick didn't slow down. They had to get Marcus's mother to safety before the lieutenant could catch up to them. As they neared the safe house, Rick's phone buzzed again. It was another message from Storm. "We've got company. They're close." Rick's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, pushing the van to its limits. "Hold on," he called back to the others. "It's going to get rough." The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring past them in a mix of shadows and light. Rick's eyes were focused on the path ahead, every nerve in his body alert. He wasn't just fighting for Marcus's mother anymore. He was fighting for the truth to be heard. They couldn't let the lieutenant win. Not this time. As the van reached the safe house, Rick pulled into the driveway, tires screeching as they came to a halt. The others were already out of the van before it had even come to a complete stop. Rick didn't waste any time. "Get inside. Now." The bikers moved quickly, ushering Marcus's mother inside and setting up a perimeter to keep watch. Rick stayed outside for a moment longer, scanning the surrounding area. They had to be prepared for anything. As the last of the bikers filed into the house, Rick finally stepped inside, locking the door behind him. "We've got a few hours before they find us," he said, his voice low and steady. "Storm, get the backup plan ready. We're not going to sit here and wait for them to come to us." Storm nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I've got it covered." Rick turned to Marcus's mother, who was sitting on the couch, looking more exhausted than he had ever seen her. Her eyes were filled with worry, but she had a sense of relief now that she was safe, even if only for a moment. "You're safe here," Rick assured her. "But we need to act fast. We need to expose the lieutenant for what he's done." She nodded weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but how do we do it? He's untouchable. He's got everyone in his pocket." Rick's jaw tightened. "Not anymore. We've got people on the inside who are ready to help. But we can't wait too long. We've got one shot at this." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled on everyone. They were in this together now, and they couldn't afford to fail. Rick paced the room, his mind spinning with a plan. He had to be smart. He had to outmaneuver the lieutenant at every turn. The truth had to come out. "We'll get him," Rick said, his voice unwavering. "But we need to move fast. And we need to stay one step ahead." As the bikers prepared for the next phase of their mission, Rick took a deep breath. This wasn't just a battle for one woman's freedom. This was a fight for justice. And he was going to make sure the lieutenant paid for everything he had done. The safe house was quiet, too quiet. Rick stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street. The silence in the room was oppressive, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The lieutenant's people would be coming for them, and soon. They had only a few hours before their location was compromised. Rick could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned to Storm, who was sitting at the table, his phone in hand, making calls to gather intel. "What's the status?" Rick asked, his voice low but steady. Storm glanced up, his face grim. "We've got eyes on the lieutenant's movements. He's pulling every string he can to find out where we are. He's already sent a couple of his guys to scout the area." Rick cursed under his breath. The lieutenant wasn't wasting any time. "How much longer before we need to move?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Storm ran his hand through his hair. "We've got maybe an hour before they figure out we're here. After that, they'll be on us." Rick nodded, his mind already running through the possibilities. "We need to act fast. We can't afford to be cornered." As he spoke, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared in the distance, cutting through the quiet night. Rick's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the door. It was the sound they had been waiting for. The bikers were ready. They had to be. Rick motioned for the group to gather around. "This is it," he said, his voice firm. "We've got one shot at this. Storm, you and the others need to make sure the lieutenant doesn't get his hands on Marcus's mom. We'll go after him. We'll hit him hard and fast." The bikers exchanged looks, their faces hard with determination. They weren't afraid of the lieutenant's men. They had faced worse, and they weren't about to back down now. As they prepared to move out, Rick turned to Marcus's mother, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes filled with fear but also a sense of hope. "Stay here," Rick said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll be back soon. Just hold tight." She nodded, her hand clutching Marcus's tightly. The little girl was sitting beside her, her small face drawn with worry but also with a fierce resolve. She knew that her mother's safety depended on the bikers now. As Rick and the others made their way to the door, the reality of what they were about to do settled in. The stakes had never been higher. They weren't just fighting for Marcus's mother anymore. They were fighting for the truth. They were fighting for justice. The bikers mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life as they sped out of the driveway. Rick led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. They had a target now, Lieutenant Donovan, and they were going to make sure he paid for everything he had done. The night air rushed past as they tore through the streets, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Rick's mind raced as he thought about the lieutenant's connections, about the corruption that ran so deep in their town. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew that they couldn't let this slide. They couldn't let someone like the lieutenant continue to manipulate the system. "Stay sharp," Rick called back to the others, his voice loud over the roar of the engines. "We're not just up against him. We're up against everything he's built. But we're going to take it down." The bikers didn't need any more words. They knew what they were there for. As they neared the lieutenant's compound, Rick's pulse quickened. They were close now, too close to back out. The compound loomed ahead, its high fences and security lights a clear sign of the power the lieutenant held. But none of that mattered to Rick. They had come this far, and they weren't about to stop. "Remember the plan," Rick called out, his voice low and controlled. "We go in fast, we take him down, and we get out before anyone has a chance to react." They approached the compound, the sound of their engines growing louder as they drew closer. The guards at the gate didn't know what hit them. The bikers tore through the perimeter with military precision, knocking out the guards and taking control of the compound's entrance before anyone had a chance to react. Rick's heart pounded as he led the charge, storming through the front door of the building. Inside, the lieutenant's men were scrambling to respond, but it was too late. The bikers were already inside. The lieutenant, hearing the commotion, emerged from a back office, his face twisted with fury. He didn't have time to draw his weapon before Rick and the others were on him, surrounding him with the force of their anger and determination. "You've made a lot of enemies, Lieutenant," Rick said, his voice cold as he stepped forward. "And now you're going to pay for it." The lieutenant sneered, but his bravado didn't last. He knew he was outnumbered, and he knew that the bikers weren't about to let him walk away this time. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down?" he spat. Rick's eyes narrowed. "You're not untouchable anymore. You've been hiding behind your badge for too long." The lieutenant's face turned pale as he realized the truth. There was no escape, no way out. His empire was crumbling, and the bikers were the ones who were going to bring it down. Rick raised his hand, signaling the others to move in. The lieutenant's reign of terror was finally over. The lieutenant was pinned against the wall, the weight of his defeat settling in as Rick and the other bikers surrounded him. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He had been untouchable, a figure of authority who used his badge to control everything around him. But now, in this dimly lit room, he was nothing. His empire was crumbling, and he had nowhere left to run. Rick stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. He had seen too much injustice, too much corruption, to let this man go unpunished. The lieutenant's bravado had faltered the moment he realized that Rick and his crew weren't backing down. The bikers weren't just fighting for Marcus's mother anymore. They were fighting for the truth to come out. The lieutenant took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. He was trapped. "You think you've won?" The lieutenant spat, his voice shaky. "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Rick's lips curled into a cold smile. "You're right about one thing. You have no idea who you're dealing with." He stepped closer to the lieutenant, his boots thudding softly on the floor. Your time is up. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all the people you've hurt, all the lives you've ruined. The lieutenant glared at him, his fists clenched. You're making a big mistake, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But Rick didn't buy it. He had heard those same words 100 times before from people who thought they were above the law. They were all the same. The lieutenant's words held no power anymore. You thought you could control everything, Rick said, his voice steady. But now it's our turn. The bikers had done their part, securing the compound, taking control. They had fought their way through the darkness, and now they were in the light, watching the truth unfold. But there was still more to be done. Rick wasn't going to let this man go without exposing everything. We're not leaving until the truth is out, Rick said, his voice firm. You're going to face justice for everything you've done. The lieutenant's face twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of fear behind his eyes. He knew, deep down, that this was the end. But he wasn't going down without a fight. With a sudden movement, he lunged forward, pushing one of the bikers out of his way and rushing for the door. But before he could make it halfway, Rick was on him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. You're not going anywhere, Rick growled. The lieutenant struggled, but it was no use. The bikers had him surrounded, and there was no way out. You think you can scare me? The lieutenant snarled, his voice filled with desperation. You're just a bunch of criminals. What's going to happen to you when the law finds out what you've done? Rick's grip tightened on his collar. The law is what we're fighting for, he said, his voice low and deadly. The truth is stronger than your badge, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what you've done. The lieutenant's eyes widened as he realized the gravity of his situation. He had spent years hiding behind his uniform, using his power to get away with everything. But now, he was alone, exposed. His grip on control was slipping, and he knew it. You think you can take me down? He spat, trying to regain his composure. You think anyone will believe you? Rick shook his head. It's not about what we believe. It's about what you've done, and the people who are going to make sure you pay for it. As Rick turned to the others, he motioned for them to bring the lieutenant into the main room. They needed to get the evidence. They needed to make sure. Everything was documented, every detail, every crime he had committed. The bikers weren't just here to take down the lieutenant. They were here to bring the truth into the light, and they weren't going to let anything stop them. The room filled with tension as the lieutenant was dragged into the center, his face twisted with anger and fear. He knew that the walls were closing in, but it was too late. The bikers were already gathering the evidence they needed. Rick stood at the front of the room, his eyes focused on the lieutenant. This is where it ends for you, Rick said. And this is where it begins for all the people you've hurt. The truth will come out. As Rick spoke, the rest of the bikers began making their calls, reaching out to those who could help expose the lieutenant's corruption. They had made their move, and now there was no turning back. The lieutenant's empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The bikers had won. They had fought for justice, and they had brought the truth to the surface. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Rick stood at the center, his eyes fixed on the lieutenant, who was now sitting slumped in a chair, his face pale with defeat. He had been a man who wielded his badge as a shield, hiding behind it for years, but now it was clear that his empire was crumbling. The bikers had done what they came to do. They had taken down the corrupt officer, but the fight wasn't over. There was still the matter of the truth. The lieutenant might have been exposed, but they needed to ensure that everyone knew the full extent of his actions. Rick motioned for one of the bikers to bring forward the evidence they had gathered. The documents, photographs, and recordings that the lieutenant had hoped would never see the light of day were now spread out on the table before them. This is just the beginning, Rick said, his voice steady, but his words were heavy with conviction. We've got the proof. Now we take it to the people. The other bikers nodded, their expressions hardening with the same resolve. They had been through hell together, and they weren't about to stop now. Storm, one of the bikers who had been instrumental in gathering intel, stepped forward. I've already set up a meeting with the right people. We can get this into the hands of the press, the courts, anyone who will listen. Rick looked at Storm, appreciating the calm determination in his voice. Good, Rick replied. We need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that the lieutenant's people will try to cover this up. As the bikers prepared to leave the room, The sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. Rick answered it immediately, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the voice on the other end. "We've got a problem," Rick said, his voice cold. "The lieutenant's connections run deep. He's not going to go down without a fight." The news hit them hard. It wasn't just the lieutenant they had to worry about now. It was the entire network of corruption he had built. Rick turned to the bikers, his face hardening. "We need to be ready for anything. They're going to come after us. But we won't back down. We're not just doing this for Marcus's mom. We're doing this for every person who's ever been wronged by the system." The bikers, each one of them a seasoned fighter in their own right, nodded in agreement. They were more than just a club, they were a family. And families didn't abandon each other. As they made their way out of the building, Rick's mind was racing. The lieutenant's downfall was just the first step. They had to make sure the entire network of corruption was exposed. But even as they moved forward, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every corner seemed to hold a new threat, every shadow hiding someone waiting to make their move. The bikers made their way to their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life one by one. As they hit the road, Rick could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he wasn't afraid. They had already come this far, and they weren't going to stop now. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers that none of them could predict. But one thing was clear, they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for justice. As they sped down the highway, the familiar hum of the engines filled the air, and Rick felt a sense of calm settle over him. They were doing the right thing. The lieutenant's empire was about to fall, and with it, the dark web of corruption he had weaved. Rick knew the battle wasn't over yet. There were still more obstacles ahead, more people to confront, and more lies to uncover. But they were ready. They were prepared to do whatever it took to expose the truth and take down anyone who tried to stand in their way. For the first time in a long while, Rick felt the weight of hope on his shoulders. They had started this journey with nothing but a promise to protect the innocent, and now they were about to bring down the very system that had allowed corruption to thrive. As the bikers rode into the night, Rick knew that they weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for the future, for the people who had no voice, for the families who had been hurt by those in power. And they weren't going to stop until the truth was heard. The road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain, but Rick felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would see this through, no matter what it took. The fight for justice had only just begun. The sound of motorcycles roared through the night as Rick led the bikers down the highway, their engines a chorus of defiance against the quiet of the world around them. The city lights blurred in the distance, but Rick wasn't focused on the road ahead. His thoughts were with the plan they had set in motion. They had gathered the evidence, exposed the lieutenant, and torn down a corrupt empire. But the final part of their mission remained, ensuring that the truth reached the public, that justice was fully served. As the group neared their destination, the safe house where they planned to meet with the media contacts who could help them, Rick's grip on the handlebars tightened. The plan was simple, but the stakes were higher than ever. They couldn't afford any slip-ups now. If they were going to get the lieutenant behind bars for good, they had to make sure the story went public, that it reached the right people, fast. The bikers followed Rick closely, a tight-knit pack that was more than just a group of people riding together. They were brothers and sisters, bound by loyalty, and their bond was stronger than any threat the lieutenant or his allies could throw at them. As Rick pulled into the driveway of the safe house, he scanned the area. It was dark, quiet, but he knew that wouldn't last. The lieutenant's people would be coming for them soon. There was no time to waste. The moment the engines died, Rick was already stepping off his bike, his mind shifting into full mission mode. "Everyone stay sharp," he said, his voice low but commanding. The bikers were quick to follow, their movements fluid, their eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Inside the safe house, the media contacts were already waiting. Storm, the biker who had been coordinating with the press, was the first to greet them. His face was tense, his eyes flickering with concern. "They're close," Storm said quietly, handing Rick a folder filled with information. "But we've got everything ready on our end. The moment the story breaks, it's going to be big." Rick nodded, feeling the weight of what was at stake. "We need to move quickly," he said. "The longer we wait, the more time the lieutenant's people have to bury the truth. We can't let that happen." As the bikers gathered around, preparing to send out the information, Rick couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency building in his chest. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for the people who had been left behind, but this was different. This wasn't just another case. This was about exposing the very system that had allowed corruption to thrive for so long. As the bikers worked, Rick took a moment to step outside. The night air hit his face, sharp and cold, as he stood in the yard, his eyes searching the dark horizon. He could feel it, the calm before the storm. They had made their move, and now there was no turning back. Rick knew that when the truth came out, the fallout would be massive. The lieutenant wasn't going down quietly, and neither would the people who had helped him maintain control. They would come for Rick and the bikers, but he was ready. They were ready. As he stood there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps behind him broke the silence. Storm appeared, his face a mixture of determination and worry. "It's time," Storm said, his voice firm. "The story's about to break." Rick nodded, turning toward the door. "Let's do this." The bikers filed into the safe house, and in a matter of moments, the information was being sent out. The media contacts were making calls, reaching out to journalists, and preparing to take the story to the news outlets. The room was filled with a quiet intensity as they worked, each person fully aware of what was at stake. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lieutenant wasn't going to let this slide. He would fight back, and he would fight dirty. But they were prepared. They had to be. As the first reports started to hit the media, Rick could feel the pressure building. The truth was out there now, and there was no taking it back. It was only a matter of time before the lieutenant's allies would try to stop them. The bikers weren't just fighting for one person's freedom. They were fighting for the future of the community, for the people who had been oppressed and silenced for too long. Rick knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the night wore on, Rick's thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. He answered it quickly, his pulse racing as he listened. The voice on the other end was familiar, someone from inside the system. "The lieutenant's people are moving in. They're going to try and take you down." Rick's grip on the phone tightened. "We're ready for them," he said, his voice steady. "We've been ready." The call ended, and Rick turned to the group. "It's time," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the situation. "We need to move. The truth is out, but we have to protect it. We have to protect all of it. We can't let them silence us now." The bikers stood, their faces hard with resolve. This wasn't just a fight for justice. This was a fight for the future. And they weren't going to back down now. The night was getting colder, and the air hung thick with tension as Rick and the bikers waited, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The safe house was quiet now, but they all knew that it wouldn't stay that way for long. The lieutenant's people were close, and they were coming for them. Rick's mind raced as he walked back and forth, trying to anticipate their next move. The media had picked up the story. The truth was out, but there was still more to be done. The bikers weren't going to sit back and wait for things to fall apart. They had come too far to stop now. Rick knew that exposing the corruption was only half the battle. The lieutenant still had connections, and there were people in power who would stop at nothing to protect him. But Rick wasn't afraid. They had the evidence, and they had each other. That was more than enough. As he stood by the window, Rick's phone buzzed. He picked it up quickly, recognizing the number. Storm's voice came through the speaker. "They're here, moving in from the east side." Rick's grip tightened around the phone. It was happening. "All right, we're moving out," Rick said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Get the others ready. We need to leave now." He didn't need to say more. The bikers knew what to do. They had trained for moments like this. As the bikers moved quickly, gathering their things and preparing to leave, Rick glanced over at Marcus's mother, who was sitting on the couch, her face drawn but determined. She had come so far, and now it was up to them to get her to safety. "You ready?" Rick asked her, his voice soft. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm ready," she replied, though the fear was still evident in her voice. Rick gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The fight wasn't over yet. The bikers moved swiftly, loading up their bikes and preparing to leave the safe house. They knew the lieutenant's men would be close, but they also knew that they had the advantage. The element of surprise was still on their side. Rick's heart was pounding as he revved the engine of his bike. This wasn't just about protecting Marcus's mother anymore. This was about taking down a corrupt system that had been allowed to thrive for too long. The bikers weren't just going to stand by and watch. They were going to fight for what was right. As they sped down the road, Rick's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. The lieutenant had connections, but They had something he didn't. They had each other. And they had the truth. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The lieutenant's men were ruthless, and there would be more battles to fight. But Rick was ready. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Rick's eyes narrowed. The road was clear, but he knew that the calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. The sound of the bikes roaring through the night was deafening, but Rick remained focused. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The bikers were in this together, and they weren't going to let anything or anyone stop them. As they neared the rendezvous point, Rick saw the flash of headlights in the distance. The lieutenant's men were closing in. It was now or never. Rick signaled to the others, and they made a sharp turn off the main road, heading into a narrow alley. The sound of their engines was drowned out by the noise of the city, and for a brief moment, Rick allowed himself to breathe. They had made it this far, but the real challenge was just beginning. The lieutenant's men would be on them soon. They needed to be ready. Rick glanced at the others, his eyes meeting each of theirs. They were all ready. They had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to act. The bikers dismounted quickly, forming a perimeter around Marcus's mother, who was now in the back of the van, hidden from view. "Stay here," Rick ordered. "We'll take care of this." The bikers moved quickly, their training kicking in as they positioned themselves, ready for whatever came next. Rick's heart raced as he moved toward the edge of the alley. He could see the lieutenant's men approaching. This was it. There was no turning back. As the first group of men turned the corner, Rick and the bikers were already on them, moving with lightning speed, cutting off any escape routes. The fight was fierce, but the bikers were quick and efficient. The lieutenant's men were no match for the skilled fighters that Rick had led into battle. They were in control now. The lieutenant's empire was crumbling, piece by piece. Rick stood at the center of the action, his mind focused on one thing: getting Marcus's mother to safety. As the last of the lieutenant's men were taken care of, Rick turned to his crew. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to get Marcus's mother to the safe house and finish what we started." The bikers nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. But Rick knew one thing for sure: they were going to win. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop until the truth was fully exposed and justice was finally served. The dust from the fight was still settling, but Rick's mind was already racing ahead. They had taken down the lieutenant's men, but the battle wasn't won yet. The truth had been exposed, but they still needed to make sure that the system wouldn't close ranks and cover up the corruption. The bikers had done their part, but there was still the final push. Marcus's mother was safe for now, hidden away in the back of the van, but Rick knew they couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. They had to get her out of the city, far from the reach of anyone who would want to silence her. The group moved swiftly, loading back into their vehicles, the sound of engines roaring back to life as they sped off into the night. The cool air cut through Rick's leather jacket, the adrenaline from the fight still coursing through his veins. But his focus was sharp. He had one goal now: to get Marcus and her mother to safety and ensure that everything they had worked for wasn't buried in the wake of the violence. As they left the city limits, Rick took a deep breath. They had to keep moving, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The lieutenant's network was powerful, and they weren't just going to let him walk away without a fight. Rick knew that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They needed to get to the safe house and lay low until everything calmed down. But with the truth now out there was no telling how quickly things would escalate. The next few hours were critical. "We need to move fast," Rick said, his voice low and urgent over the radio. The bikers acknowledged the order, each of them understanding the gravity of the situation. The convoy moved at full speed, weaving through the darkened streets, keeping their distance from the main highways. They had to avoid drawing attention. The last thing they needed was for the lieutenant's allies to catch wind of their plans. As they neared the safe house, Rick glanced in the rearview mirror. The rest of the bikers were right behind him, their headlights like a line of fire in the night. He could see the determination on their faces, their resolve unshaken. But he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. When they reached the safe house, the group disbanded quickly, getting Marcus's mother and the others inside. The house was old, with a sense of isolation that made it the perfect place to lay low for a while. Rick and Storm quickly checked the perimeter, making sure that no one had followed them. For the moment, they were safe. But Rick wasn't about to relax just yet. He had a job to finish. "We've got a lot of work to do," Rick said, turning to his crew. "The truth is out, but it won't be long before they try to shut it down. We need to make sure the world hears it." Storm nodded, his face grim. "We've got the contacts. We'll make sure the story gets out. But we need to be prepared for fallout." Rick's jaw tightened. "I know, but we're not backing down now. Not after everything we've been through." As the bikers set up watch around the house, Rick went inside to check on Marcus and her mother. The little girl was sitting by her mother's side, her face pale but determined. She had been through so much, but Rick could see that she was stronger than anyone realized. "How are you holding up?" Rick asked softly, kneeling down to her level. Marcus looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but still shadowed by fear. "We're okay," she said quietly. "But I'm scared. What if they come for us?" Rick placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a reassuring smile. "They won't. You're safe here, and we're going to make sure you stay safe." As he turned to leave, he felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. But the world outside was still a dangerous place. He had to keep moving, keep fighting. The fight wasn't over yet. As the night wore on, Rick kept his eyes on the horizon. The safe house was secure for now, but he knew they had to stay vigilant. The lieutenant's reach was long, and there were still those who would try to cover up his crimes. But Rick wasn't going to let that happen. Not while he had breath in his lungs. They had already fought too hard. And now, with the truth exposed, there was no turning back. The lieutenant's empire was falling apart, and the bikers were going to make sure it stayed that way. They weren't just fighting for Marcus's mother anymore. They were fighting for every person who had ever been wronged, every voice that had ever been silenced. They were fighting for justice. And no one, not the lieutenant or anyone else, was going to stop them. The night was far from over, and Rick knew the real fight was just beginning. The morning light crept through the blinds of the safe house, casting long shadows across the room. Rick stood at the window, his eyes scanning the quiet street outside, but his mind was miles away. The fight they had started was far from over. The lieutenant's empire was falling apart, but the final confrontation still loomed. He could feel the pressure building. It was only a matter of time before the lieutenant made his move. The truth had been exposed, but the forces behind the corruption were still powerful. Rick knew that the media coverage was only the first step. They still had to bring everything to the authorities and make sure the lieutenant didn't get away. The sound of motorcycles in the distance brought Rick back to the present. He turned and saw the other bikers gathering in the main room. They were all still on edge, but there was a new energy in the air. They were no longer just fighting for one person. They were fighting for justice, for every person who had ever been hurt by the system. They had a purpose now, and nothing was going to stop them. Rick walked over to the group, his voice steady. "We're not done yet. The truth is out, but we've got to make sure it stays out there. The lieutenant still has allies, and we can't let him slip away." Storm, who had been coordinating with their media contacts, stepped forward. "The story's already out, but we need to be ready for the backlash. The lieutenant's going to make a move. We have to stay ahead of him." Rick nodded, his gaze hardening. "We'll stay one step ahead. We've come too far to stop now. We need to make sure the authorities are involved, and we need to protect Marcus's mother." He turned to Marcus and her mother, both of whom were sitting quietly in the corner. Marcus had a determined look on her face, but Rick could see the fear still there. It was the fear of what might happen next. "You're safe here," Rick said, offering her a reassuring smile. "But we need to keep moving. We can't stay in one place for too long." The little girl nodded, her grip tightening on her mother's hand. She had seen too much already, but Rick knew she was stronger than most people realized. The group quickly gathered their things, preparing for their next move. The safe house had served its purpose, but it was no longer safe. They had to keep moving, keep ahead of the lieutenant's reach. As they prepared to leave, Rick felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just fighting for Marcus's mother anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been betrayed by the system, for every victim who had been silenced by corruption. They weren't going to let the lieutenant get away with this. The sound of engines revving echoed through the safe house as the bikers mounted their motorcycles. The convoy was ready to roll, moving out in perfect synchronization, just as they had done countless times before. But this time, there was more at stake. This time, it wasn't just about the ride. It was about justice. They sped down the highway, the familiar hum of their bikes filling the air. Rick's mind was focused on the task ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The lieutenant's people had to be close. As they neared the edge of town, Rick's phone buzzed. It was Storm. They've got eyes on you. They know you're moving. Stay sharp. Rick cursed under his breath. Thanks for the heads up, he replied, his voice tight. He turned to the others. Stay sharp. We're not letting them catch us off guard. The bikers rode with a new intensity, their eyes scanning the road ahead, ready for anything. As they neared the location where they planned to meet with their allies and law enforcement, Rick couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. This was it. This was the moment when everything they had fought for would either come to fruition or fall apart. The convoy made a sharp turn onto a side road, pulling into a secluded area near the outskirts of town. They parked their bikes in a tight formation, their engines cutting off at once, leaving only the sounds of the wind and their breathing in the air. This is where we make our stand, Rick said, his voice steady, his gaze intense. We expose everything. The truth doesn't die here. Storm and the other bikers moved quickly, preparing for what was to come. Rick approached the small group of law enforcement officers waiting for them. He recognized a few faces from the earlier days, when they had worked together to uncover the lieutenant's ties to the drug cartel. But this wasn't just about drugs. This was about a system of corruption that had poisoned the very institutions that were supposed to protect the people. The officers looked uneasy, but they had a job to do. They had to stand with Rick and the bikers. They had to bring the lieutenant to justice, no matter the cost. Rick handed them the evidence they had gathered, photographs, documents, recordings, all the pieces that proved the lieutenant's guilt. This is it, Rick said, his voice low. The truth is all here. We're counting on you to make sure it's not buried. The officers nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. We'll take it from here, one of them said, his voice firm. You did the right thing. As the officers left to deliver the evidence to the higher-ups, Rick turned to the rest of the group. We've done our part. Now it's up to them to finish it. But Rick wasn't sure how long it would take. The lieutenant's reach was long, and there would be people trying to shut it down. But Rick had no doubt that the bikers had made the difference. The truth had a way of finding the light, no matter how hard the darkness tried to hide it. The sun was setting as Rick and the bikers gathered around their bikes, the weight of the day's events settling in. The lieutenant's reign of terror was finally over, but Rick knew that this victory came at a cost. The truth had been exposed, but there would always be those who tried to bury it again. The battle had been long, and they had fought tooth and nail to get to this point. But now, as the night fell, the air felt lighter. They had done it. The truth was out there, and the system was starting to crack. Rick stood at the edge of the group, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could still hear the rumble of the motorcycles in the distance, the sound of their engines a reminder of the fight they had just won. But there was more to be done. They had taken down the lieutenant, but the network of corruption he had built was vast, and Rick knew that there were still more people to hold accountable. He turned to the others. We did it, Rick said, his voice low but full of pride. But this isn't over. We've exposed the truth, but there are still others who need to be brought down. We need to keep going. Storm, standing beside him, nodded. I know. But tonight, we celebrate. The other bikers gathered around, their faces still hard but with a sense of accomplishment that couldn't be ignored. They had fought for what was right, and they had won. They had risked everything for justice, and now, the city was starting to change. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air as they sat around a fire, the warmth of the flames pushing away the chill of the night. For the first time in a long time, Rick felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step in the right direction. They had shown the world that the truth couldn't be buried forever. And in the end, that was what mattered most. As the fire crackled, Rick thought about Marcus and her mother. They had made it through the storm, and now they could start to rebuild their lives. It wouldn't be easy, but they had the chance. The hope that had been extinguished for so long was beginning to return. We gave them a fighting chance, Rick said quietly, mostly to himself. Storm glanced at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. You've done more than that, brother. You've changed their lives. Rick nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. He couldn't stop now. There was still work to be done. He couldn't let the fight for justice end here. As the night stretched on, Rick and the bikers made their plans. They would take down the rest of the lieutenant's network, expose the corruption that had been festering for so long, and make sure that those in power would no longer be able to hide behind their badges. They would bring justice to those who had been wronged. The bikers weren't just a club anymore. They were a movement, a force for change. And no matter how long it took, Rick knew they wouldn't stop until the truth was heard. As dawn broke and the first light of day touched the horizon, the bikers packed up their gear and prepared to move out. Their mission wasn't over. It had only just begun. But they were ready. They had already fought for the truth, and now they would continue to fight for justice. No one would stop them. The lieutenant may have been taken down, but the battle for a better world was still ahead. With that, Rick climbed onto his bike, his engine roaring to life. The rest of the bikers followed suit, their bikes filling the air with a familiar hum. They were no longer just riding for themselves. They were riding for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been wronged by those in power. They were riding for justice. And no matter what happened next, Rick knew they would never stop fighting. They had already made history, and they would continue to make it, one ride at a time. As the convoy of bikers sped down the road, Rick looked ahead, the open road stretching out before them. The sun was rising, and with it, a new day. A day full of possibilities. And Rick knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were ready to face them together. The fight for justice would never end, but with every mile, they were one step closer to the world they wanted to build.